Hello and welcome. These recordings are designed for students sitting the CIE IGCSE History exam, and we'll go over some of the more common Paper 4 questions. You might find it useful to have a pen and paper to hand, or you might just want to listen through as part of your revision, which is fine too. Today we'll be looking at the following question. Who supported and opposed the Nazi state? Now, as you know, technique is different for a Paper 4 than it is, say, for a Part C Paper 1 response. First of all, you have a full hour to answer one question, and also you have a choice of one question from two possible options, normally Weimar and the Nazis, although in some years you get two Weimar or two Nazi questions, so it's important to be prepared for any eventuality. But given the 60 minutes, it is a proper full essay, and you should be writing in a more advanced manner. This audio recording still suggests that you use the PE technique, but perhaps that you develop it further and turn it into a PEE 2.0, which is to say, you provide your point clearly, you back it up with evidence in the form of names, dates, statistics, quotations, people, places and events, but that you then explain in two different ways, using connectives and phrases like "this suggests" or "this shows." Don't settle for one layer of analysis. Okay, so let's get started. Who supported and opposed the Nazi state? Any good Paper 4 will start with an introduction, and your introduction should follow the DCO technique. In other words, define the key terms in the question, give a little bit of context, and then outline your scope, in other words, your PEEs. So for this question, you may wish to define what you understand by support and opposition. Bear in mind that historian Detlev Peukert argues that there is a hierarchy of opposition or Widerstand, ranging from high-level resistance, such as that of Stauffenberg and his bomb plot, which we will discuss, all the way down to people telling jokes or complaining about bread prices. In terms of context, you might wish to mention the nature of the totalitarian regime which Hitler put in place, with groups like the SS, the SD and the Gestapo. And then finally, we'll conclude our introduction by outlining our scope, which in this case will discuss the role of youth, the churches, army and business. And for the first three of these, we will argue that they supported or opposed it, but for business we will just argue that they supported it. So in total it will be a 7-part scope. 4 arguing that these institutions supported the Nazi state, and then 3 arguing that they were against it. So let's get going. We'll start with the argument that various aspects of society supported the Nazi state. Point 1. Youth. Evidence to support this includes: the Nazis controlled schools under Hans Schem, as well as curriculum and teachers. For example, the idea of Untermenschen or subhumans was taught in biology, and the Dolchstoß or stab in the back in World War I was taught in history. And we know that history is crucial for Hitler because he famously said that it was his favourite subject, which, considering he went on to be an artist, is quite something. And he was taught by a man called Dr. Leopold Polch, who was a famed nationalist within his local area. young boys were expected to join the Hitler Youth. There were 9 million, or if you rather, 90% by 1938, and this included the future Pope Benedict. It had been made compulsory for boys to join by 1939, and girls were forced to join the League of German Maidens. Hitler said of this malleable group, quote, "What material? With them I can make a new world," unquote, in 1939. And Henry Mettelmann, an ex-Nazi who fought in the Panzer Division in World War II, who later moved on to work as a caretaker in an English school, described the Hitler Youth as a great feeling. So in explaining this first point, we could argue that there were many young people who supported the Nazi state. Point 2. Churches. Evidence to suggest that the churches supported the Nazi state include: Pope Pius XII has been nicknamed Hitler's Pope by historian Cornwell. It was Pius who signed the Concordat in June 1933 with the Nazis, which meant they could not stand up to them. Many have placed this in a historical context of anti-Catholic anti-Semitism. For example, there's always been the charge of deicide against the Jews, and this was not dropped until the Second Vatican Council of 1978. Moreover, St. William of Norwich and St. Hugh of Lincoln in the Middle Ages revealed medieval Catholic anti-Semitism, and this is known as the blood libel. So in explaining this point, you may wish to argue that there were some in the Church, particularly Pope Pius XII, who could be seen to be upholding and supporting the Nazi states, or at least staying neutral. Point 3. The Army. Evidence to support this includes: many felt the Nazis were bringing back much needed discipline and clamping down on communism. Also, Hitler's foreign policy successes up to 1938 led many to see him as a national saviour post-Versailles. Indeed, there were many nationalists who shared his opinion about revising the Treaty of Versailles. Victor Klemperer, a Jewish university lecturer, wrote in 1933, quote, "Germany prefers Hitler to communists," unquote. And so in explaining this point, you may wish to argue that, particularly with the oath to Hitler, there were many in the army who supported the Nazi state. Finally, for this side of the argument, point 4, business. Evidence to support this includes: many workers feared losing their jobs, and for this reason, companies such as Hugo Boss, who designed Nazi uniforms, IBM, and Robert Bosch, who we all know for making drills, all backed the Nazis. So too did the Auto Union, which later became Audi. The Depression was fresh in memories, and so the Nazis received significant financial support from many areas of business. In explaining this, you may wish to argue that business supported the Nazi state. Okay, now for the magic words. On the other hand, there were groups who opposed Nazism, and we're now going to talk through 3 PEEs that will explain this counter-argument, starting with point 1, youth. Evidence to support that youth were against the Nazism movement included the swing kids. Joseph Goebbels described this as asphalt culture, or tarmac culture, due to its black roots. Jitterbugging was a very close, non-Nazi way of dancing. Swing kids had long hair and listened to American influences. Moreover, we have groups like the Edelweiss Pirates, of whom subgroups were named things like the Roving Dudes of Essen and the Kittelbach Pirates of Dusseldorf. They sang mocking songs and they threw stones at the Hitler Youth. Bartel Schink was a famous example of an Edelweiss pirate who was killed for his role in that movement. In December 1942, the Gestapo broke up 28 groups containing 739 adolescents. There were 2 million people who avoided joining the Hitler Youth. Moreover, we have other youth groups such as Sophie Scholl and the White Rose Group. Sophie was a student at university who formed a resistance group with her brother Hans called the White Rose in the summer of 1942, and she helped to distribute 5 illegally printed leaflets in their thousands, which encouraged resistance against the Nazis. On the 18th of February 1943, a caretaker discovered a leaflet and phoned the secret police. On the 22nd of February, all 3 conspirators were sentenced to death and Sophie herself was beheaded. But all of this evidence adds up to our explanation, which is there were significant areas of young people and youth society which did not support the Nazi regime. Point 2. Churches. Evidence to support that churches did not support the Nazi regime are many. We must remember that religion was perhaps the most obvious mechanism to stand up to Nazism. They both had large followings, they both had leaders, and it could be seen as a natural enemy. Catholic Bishop Galen criticised the Nazis, and Protestant ministers like Dietrich Bonhoeffer did too. Moreover, Pastor Martin Niemöller spent 7 years in a concentration camp for his role in opposing the Nazis, and so in explaining this second point, you may wish to argue that there were many religious groups in the churches who did oppose the Nazi states. Finally, point 3, the army. Evidence to support this includes: now, we argued earlier that the oath given to the army by many Germans was a suggestion that the army supported Hitler. But there were some who did not. And Klaus Philipp Maria Graf von Stauffenberg is a famous example of this. Born into an aristocratic family, he joined the army in 1926 and became famous for taking part in Operation Walküre, the attempt to assassinate Adolf Hitler in July 1944. The plan failed and he was arrested and executed the following day. Following this attempt, nearly 5,000 people were arrested and 200 were executed as a direct result of the assassination plot due to possible affiliation. The policy of Sippenhaft was enacted, and this was a Nazi law that held the entire Stauffenberg family liable for treason. Whereas French resistance, for example, was resisting a foreign power, it was harder for most Germans to reconcile resistance without seeing it as internal treason, and so examples such as that of Stauffenberg and Goerdeler should be held up in extremely high esteem. So, we've given 4 points suggesting that some people supported Nazism. These included youth, churches, the army, and business. We've then used the magic words "on the other hand" and given 3 points, backed up with evidence that's been precisely selected to suggest that some people opposed the Nazi state. These included youth, churches, and the army. So now it's time for our clever conclusion. Historian Detlef Peukert's model of resistance or Widerstand remains a good one. There was more low-level resistance. but it was less effective than the smaller amount of high-level resistance. So overall, this essay disagrees with the notion that Jonah Goldhagen gives that all Germans were Hitler's willing executioners, because the nature of the police state made resistance difficult and sometimes impossible. Nevertheless, it is important to celebrate the opposition to the Third Reich. Okay, thank you very much for listening. I hope you found this useful. If you did, feel free to follow me on Twitter at Mr. Guiney History, or to subscribe to my YouTube channel for further pieces of advice. Bye bye.